ceritanya? I'm really excited to be here in Minsk, and today I'll be talking about typesetting East Asian languages on the web with CSS, and how such techniques can also be used for other languages, for art direction and designing layouts. But before I begin, can I have a show of hands if anybody speaks any East Asian languages, Chinese, Japanese? My guess was none, so this is going to be fun. So, like I was introduced, I'm from Malaysia. Basketball got me into web, and I sometimes write about CSS on my blog. I also recently became a Mozilla tech speaker. I have a fellow tech speaker somewhere in the audience today, and the Tech Speakers program is an initiative by Mozilla that supports technical evangelists in regional communities around the world by providing resources and funding. So let's get into it. But before we can start talking about typography, we have to start talking about writing systems. Writing systems are visual representations of verbal communication, a means to record whatever we say in our respective languages. The world is very diverse when it comes to language and culture, so it's only natural that there are many different writing systems used all over the planet. And a majority of the world use writing systems that consist of alphabets. Here we have a bunch of different alphabets, and before I got here, I tried to learn a little bit of Belarusian. I only got as far as Yaholotne, and this might be wrong, but I can say Jayamahu Znaitsi Draniki. Food is very important to me. But I did learn that the Belarusian alphabet has 32 letters, and this is much less than the medieval Cyrillic alphabet, which had 43 letters. Now, the Hebrew alphabet has 22 letters, Arabic has 28 letters, English has 26. Now, the point I'm trying to make here is that alphabetic writing systems make use of a small set of letters to form all the different words in that language. But Chinese is different. It's a logographic language which characters number in the tens of thousands. Each character is a unique glyph that can express meaning on its own or be combined with other glyphs to form other phrases. For example, zahaplenia. This is a Belarusian word, 10 letters to spell. Chinese, we only need 2 characters, rumi. The word communication in English takes 13 letters to spell. Chinese, we say goutong. Greenhrijverdeutelijkte, Irish word, 21 letters to spell. Chinese, we can do it with 2. Sure. It's as if Twitter was built for the Chinese language. And although a lot of the world mostly read from left to right, writing systems go in all directions. Modern-day vertical writing applies to East Asian scripts that utilize Han characters, like Chinese, Korean, Japanese. These are read from right to left. Mongolian also uses vertical writing, but it's read from left to right, so all kinds of different directions. Han characters are sometimes called square characters because each character is composed within a uniform square, and Chinese text can be typeset into neat rows and columns. If you don't understand Chinese, you might not know which direction the text is going because it could be vertical right to left or horizontal top to bottom. The Chinese script is said to have developed separately from the Proto-Sinaitic scripts that were the origins of alphabetic languages, which is why the Indo-European writing systems are inherently different from those used in East Asia. Now, as different alphabetic writing systems branched out from the Phoenician alphabet, their letter forms evolved and changed. The appearances of letter forms were often directly influenced by the tools used to create them. The earliest letters were sans serif, when writing was done with a hard reed pen. Serifs may have come about due to a transition to another writing implement like a flat, stiff brush. For quick, informal writing, cursive scripts like Old Roman soon emerged. The Cyrillic alphabet was derived from the Greek uncial script, and this was developed from Old Roman, so it's an evolution. Now, Chinese characters have also seen their own path of evolution from 1600 BCE, when the earliest glyphs were scratched into turtle bones and shells and stuff like that. This early script was known as oracle bone script because ancient rulers would use them to ask various higher powers very important questions like agriculture, warfare, the weather, how many sons they would have. And while Latin-based scripts are classified into serifs and sans serifs, Chinese has its own script classification. And these four are mainly used for printing Chinese publications today. We have something called Songti, Kaiti, Fangsongti, and Heiti. And because of the large volume of glyphs required, creating Chinese typefaces takes years of effort by teams of designers. If you look at any Chinese system font on your machine, they'll probably cover more than 30,000 glyphs. For a typeface to be viably used as body copy, they'll probably need a minimum coverage of 7,000 glyphs for simplified Chinese or 13,000 for traditional Chinese. That's the minimum amount before a designer can say, my font is ready. For the longest time, writing has been done on analog mediums. We've etched things on bones, we've inscribed on stone, we've written on parchment and paper, but all these things, these are things that we can feel and we can touch. But the medium of today is the screen and our browsers. As more and more of our communications move onto the digital realm, it is important that we preserve language diversity. I believe that most people in this audience speaks more than one language. And if you can recall the words I tried to pronounce earlier, is it really possible to fully express the meaning of Zahaplenia in another language? Something gets lost in translation. There are more than 7,000 languages spoken globally, but only a tiny proportion are represented in the online world. English is currently the dominant language used on the web, largely because digital technologies were pioneered in English-speaking countries. Languages are representative of human heritage, and embedded within every language are the values and beliefs of a people and the history of our cultures. There aren't that many Belarusian language schools, and the situation seems to be more problematic at the preschool and university level. 85% of books published in Belarus each year are in Russian, while Belarusian books take up only 9.5% of the market. But maybe the internet can help with that. The number of internet users in Belarus has grown from 2.1 million in 2008 to 6.7 million at the end of last year. Such explosive growth is an opportunity for the creation and proliferation of Belarusian content. And this is why internationalization is such a priority at the W3C. It is crucial that a technology meant to be ubiquitous supports the creation of local content across the world, and that every writing system in the world can be correctly rendered on the web. Now, my not-so-secret agenda for this talk is to encourage you to create more content in your respective mother tongues. And the CSS we cover today can help with presenting that local content correctly on the web. And if you happen to be an English speaker, don't worry, the web was built for you by default, so everything mentioned here will work just fine. It's all relevant anyway. So anything we see on the screen has everything to do with the field of computer graphics. And digital typography is a cross-disciplinary field that involves technical engineering, aesthetic design, and mathematical precision. And when we talk about typography on the web, one of the first things that comes to mind is web fonts. And I admit this is a rather web font-heavy session today. And let's ask the question first, what is exactly a font? In the world of metal typesetting, this is a font. So if you're familiar with letterpress printing, you may have seen drawers containing individual metal sorts, or for Chinese fonts, we have shelves. We have rows and rows of type shelves. Now, in the digital world, these are fonts. Specifically, these are font files. And for both analog and digital fonts, you can think of them as collections of glyphs. So what is a glyph? A glyph is the specific shape of a letter or a character of a particular font. So this is a glyph, nice letter. This is also a glyph. That last one's also a glyph. Now, in the digital world, everything is data. So glyphs can be described as an array of pixels, collections of vector images, or even paths of Bezier curves and straight lines. Different font formats store information about the font, like their glyphs, their encodings, the metadata about the font, and so on, differently based on how their specifications were written. But why do we have so many different font formats? The earliest fonts were pixel-based bitmaps, and that was okay for low-resolution screens of the past, but didn't work out so well for high-resolution printing. So one of the solutions to this problem came from Adobe founder John Warnock, who created PostScript in 1985. It was the very first vector font, and it really took off. Now, TrueType was Apple and Microsoft's answer to Adobe's font monopoly. Microsoft came up with TrueType Open in '94, and eventually Adobe joined in, and together they developed OpenType. Microsoft also tried to push something called EOT, which is Embedded OpenType, but this was rejected at the W3C for WOF, or Web Open Font Format. WOF2 is an improvement over WOF with better compression rates. So that's that right there. And on the practical side of things, we use the font face rule to declare a list of different font formats then in the hopes that browsers can support the fonts that we're trying to use. Nowadays, it's pretty safe to go with just WOF2 and WOF. Now, the font face rule has many descriptors, but only font family and source are mandatory. The font family descriptor is simply a label that we reference in later CSS declarations. So for example, maybe you're using a font like Helvetica. You don't have to use Helvetica as the font family. You could say, call it Zephyr. It will still work. The source descriptor tells the browser where to find the font file. It could be an external URL, it could be a locally installed font, and it includes an optional font hint. If the browser doesn't support a particular font format stated in the hint, it won't even bother looking for the font. Now, descriptors for style, weight, and stretch are used to match styles to a particular typeface in later CSS declarations. So if you're bored at work, you could assign, say, a really thick black typeface to a font weight of 100. And your team will be totally confused at why setting a weight of 100 gives them this massively bold typeface. I mean, if office pranks are your thing, it's not my fault if you get in trouble. And like Peter mentioned earlier, the Unicode range descriptor. It allows us to create composite fonts that mix glyphs from different fonts for different scripts. So this particular presentation is typeset in a font called Faro, and it does not support Cyrillic characters. So I use the Unicode range descriptor to tell my browser to load a second font when I encounter any Cyrillic characters. So for font face rules, the font family is simply a label. So what I've done here is actually created a composite font that uses the name Faro, but in actuality, it's actually loading two different font files depending on what characters need to be displayed. Now, I really have to shout out the Firefox DevTools here. If you're doing a lot of design work in the browser, it has like a grid inspector, flexbox inspector, shapes editor. I could go on. But my point here is that there is a font panel that shows you what fonts are loaded on your page. And if you're using the latest Firefox Nightly, you can toggle this font highlighter feature by editing your browser's configuration. So I have this habit of subsetting my fonts quite aggressively, and like Peter mentioned, sometimes I get it wrong, and it becomes very unsightly. So for presentations like this one, I only include characters for the few Belarusian words that I needed to use. So occasionally, I will miss a character or two, so the letters will get rendered with the fallback font. So sometimes the fallback font, I can see that it's being rendered from the fonts panel, but I can't really visually see which one it is. With the font highlighter tool, I can easily see which character on my page is using which font. So something to try out if you're interested. Now, CSS font properties are our typesetting tools for the web. When you use them in your CSS declarations, imagine that you're running your own print workshop. And you're telling your apprentice, in this case, the browser, that you need a font of a particular size, weight, style, etc. And then your apprentice then runs off to the back room, where all the fonts are kept, and tries to find the font that best matches your instructions, based on what you declared in your font face rule. So let's look at one which is not so commonly used at the moment, which is font synthesis. Because your smart apprentice can sometimes be a bit too smart. Sometimes the true italic or heavier version of a font doesn't actually exist on the system or anywhere. So the browser will try to recreate that effect based off the regular font that was loaded. In fact, Chinese does not have italic variants. So we can set the font synthesis property to a value of none to tell the browser to just leave the font alone. Font feature properties were introduced in Fonts Level 3, which just became a candidate recommendation today. They allow us to utilize a variety of typographic features like swashes, ligatures, old-style numerals, etc. And reading text that is typeset well through the use of features like small caps, like italics, proper punctuation, is like listening to a compelling speaker. Other features like old-style numerals and ligatures, they maintain typographic color, which help the reading experience be more comfortable. And it's necessary to hold your reader's attention. And as long as the font you're using supports these features, you can toggle them with CSS. There's one particular font variant property used for East Asian text, and it allows us to control glyph substitution and positioning for Han characters, because depending on the language, the same character does not necessarily use the same glyph. So this property allows us to toggle between variant glyphs of certain characters. A friend of mine built a tool that can tell you what features a font has, and the appropriate CSS you can use to toggle them. It also wins the award, my personal award, for best name of an app I've ever seen. It's called Wakamai Fondue. What can my font do? So do check it out. Now, OpenType font variations, aka variable fonts, were introduced in September 2016 and has been gaining quite a lot of traction this year. And I'm pretty sure we'll all get our minds blown by Bram later in this talk after this one. A variable font is the equivalent of multiple individual fonts compactly packaged within a single font file, which can potentially be a big plus when it comes to performance, especially for languages that have very large glyph sets like the CJK languages. As a preview to Bram's talk, I'm showing you this incredible demo by Mandy Michael. The word grass here, it is not a video, it is not a GIF, it is actual text that you can select and you can search on page. So in addition to performance, the dynamism of variable fonts makes it perfect for the web medium and opens up a world of creative possibility. Now, vertical writing may be traditionally seen in East Asian languages, but you don't have to miss out on the fun if you don't design for these languages. Vertical layouts are not a new thing. Print design has had plenty of those for quite a while now. It's just that the web hadn't reached a level of maturity that could do it well until recently. So I want to introduce the writing mode property. This deals specifically with vertical text. You literally can turn the browser on its side. And some of you might be saying, can't we already do that with CSS transforms? But it's different, because changing the writing mode alters the element's box alignment axes. This is what happens to your text when different values of writing mode are applied. So the default is horizontal top to bottom. And to change the direction to vertical, we can set vertical LR, left to right, or vertical RL, right to left. And when we rotate text, it's not only the lines that change direction, because each line contains individual characters, and they have an orientation as well. So for text orientation, the initial value is mixed, because browsers are smart enough to tell which languages can be typeset in both vertical and horizontal orientation, or horizontal only. So Chinese characters, for example, will always appear upright, while horizontal-only languages like English will have their characters rotated when vertical. But the text orientation property allows us to control this and make all the characters upright or sideways if we want to. The last property in the set is text combined upright, which allows us to address the issue of numerals or abbreviations in vertical text. For example, if the text contains dates, you get to fit all the digits into the space of a one-character width. Now, one of the proposed values for this property is digits, which controls the number of glyphs that you can squeeze into this tiny little space, but no browser supports it yet. All we have now is all. So this works fairly well if you have a four-letter word like Cuba, but when the word gets a bit longer, things start to get a bit tight, so probably don't use it for really, really long words. If you do happen to work with languages that use East Asian text, here are some suggestions for typesetting them. use the correct font family, because different languages use different glyphs for the same character, and it's important to pick a font that supports the glyphs for the correct language. Han characters also have a lot of strokes and visually appear more dense than Latin alphabets, so it may be necessary to bump up the font size a little bit. Larger line height is also required to improve readability for the same reason, because if the line height is too small, it gets very hard to read, and the whole page gets, the typographic color of the whole page gets a bit too heavy. Now, usually margins between paragraphs already exist, but do take note not to let the amount of space between two paragraphs become too wide. And lastly, as mentioned before, because Han characters are square characters, the start and end lines of the text should be aligned neatly. Now, laying content out in a different orientation requires a change in perspective, and I gleaned quite a few insights from working with vertical layouts. For example, the techniques I was so used to for centering text worked a little bit different in a vertical layout. To vertically center a block, setting top and bottom margins to auto actually works, which is great, unlike in horizontal writing. But if you try to center something horizontally, it's a very painful experience. Now, these directions of top, right, bottom, left start getting a bit confusing when you have rotated Latin text. For example, I have a header and a bunch of text, right? And the text and the header are really close together, so I want some space there. I want to give it some breathing room. Would you set the margin on the bottom of the header or on the left of the header? Take note that this is now a vertically set piece of text. You actually set the margin on the left of the header, and I personally find this very confusing. That's why we have a CSS logical properties specification. Instead of directions like left or right, we use properties like block start and block end, or inline start and inline end. These directions will continue to make sense even if the writing mode of your document changes. Support wasn't great when I first tried it out, but it looks much better now, and it will continue to become more green as we go along. So do give it a try and try to wrap your head around these logical directions instead of physical ones. Now, these writing mode properties allow us to properly typeset vertical text on the web, and it is a step towards ensuring that a key aspect of East Asian culture can live on in the digital world, and maybe even thrive. Implementing vertical layouts has become much easier as browser vendors continue to improve the functionality of their products. And this opens up an aspect of graphic design that we don't often see on the web at the moment. This is a magazine by the payments company Stripe, and you can see that they use some vertical elements, for example, the About and the Issues link. But we still don't see this very much on the web. For example, you can make a bookshelf-style list of posts like this with only CSS. Something like this can be done by setting vertical RL to each list item, and you add in some padding, some insert shadows, and you can get such a visual effect. Laying out long passages of text for Latin-based left-to-right languages is kind of a bad idea, but for short things like titles or maybe headers, a vertical orientation can help break up the monotony of a really long scrolling page. Other subtle uses of vertical text could be for tags on blog posts, or wherever information is not critical to the main content. So laying it out vertically does not adversely affect your reading experience. Now, there are even more possibilities when we combine such techniques with media queries. When the viewport gets too narrow, we can revert to a horizontal layout that makes better use of the available space. Conversely, there are also instances where having text rotated vertically can work well on narrow screen sizes as well, because studies have shown that the hamburger menu wasn't the best design pattern that we came up with. So depending on the number of links in your menu, maybe laying them out vertically along the side edge could be a design to consider. And I'm sure many of you can come up with even more interesting designs that make use of vertical layouts. Statistically, there aren't that many sites that use writing mode at the moment. So when I first tried to use Flexbox with vertical writing mode, I broke my browser. Yeah. I then poked around, and then I realized that there are a very large number of cross-browser issues. Now, if you're wondering why I just made you sit through like almost half an hour of vertical text and typesetting just to find out that support is a pile of poo, don't worry, I'm not trying to lead you on. In fact, I'm trying to make a point. It's precisely because too few people were using Flexbox with vertical writing mode that a large number of browser bugs remained undiscovered. And this applies to other CSS properties as well. Browser release cycles have shortened immensely over the years. I mean, just look at how dense the blue is over the last 5 years. Each dot represents a browser release date. So it's safe to say that evergreen browsers have become common. It's a thing now. And bug fixes and new features are being shipped faster than ever before. So it's much easier to get enthusiastic about CSS features these days because they ship and become more widely supported more quickly. And the same goes for bug fixes. If a property you were using was buggy, odds are it might not be buggy in a few months' time. Every major browser engine has a pretty open process for raising bugs. And raising bugs for a particular feature sends a signal to browser vendors that developers want to use this feature. And this encourages them to prioritize related bug fixes. Look, it's a win for everyone. By taking the time to submit a bug report, you can gain karma points, you get your bug fixed, and you make the web better for all of us. And by the way, the Flexbox bug that I showed earlier, it got fixed in the next release. So I'm just saying, raise a bug. So some further reading for anyone who would like to find out more about what I covered today. If you need inspiration for vertical layouts, then the Tateyoko Web Awards site has a really nice list. It is an award that is given to sites that make use of vertical layouts, because this is a relatively newer CSS property. It was meant to increase awareness of the fact that we can do vertical layouts on the web today, so there are a lot of good examples there. There is also Jen Simmons' experimental layout lab, where she showcases all that is possible with modern CSS today. So she updates it quite often, so you could bookmark it and check back from time to time to see what she's added. And to me, attending conferences is not really to gain expertise overnight. I'm actually here to discover new things that I did not know existed, and perhaps even gain insights and hear perspectives that never occurred to me before. So the techniques I talked about today may be relevant to you, maybe not. But that's fine, that's perfectly fine, because this talk was meant to show you what the web is capable of and what we can potentially build with it. So one day, when you do work on a project that needs these techniques, you might recall that you heard about it here at CSS-Minsk-JS. Daku.
Eugene, thank you. We invite you to have a short interview.
Sure.
Awesome talk. Guys, did you love the talk?
Thanks.
So, the first question, what would be someone's motivation? What would you advise for the developer, like some internal mindset to support Eastern typography? Because, for example, I know for a fact that in Russia it's really bad.
I think the business case for it is if your market or your target audience are people who are native speakers of East Asian languages, because for somebody who doesn't, it seems like it looks okay, but it becomes quite glaring if your audience, it kind of is distracting, because they can identify that, oh, this looks a bit off, this looks a bit wrong, and it kind of takes away their focus from what you're actually trying to say to the typesetting is a bit off. So that's probably, I think, tying back to the same answer that the previous speakers mentioned. It's about who your target audience is, or who you want your target audience to be. If that is an area that you're looking to expand into, it might be worth the investment.
And my question is, language is a part of our culture, of course, and do you think that internationalization is the priority for us as developers today?
I feel that because the web it was English by default, a lot of us who don't speak English as our first languages sort of just fall into, oh, it's supposed to be this way. And we kind of, to a certain extent, I feel sometimes our own mother tongues are neglected. And that's why we end up with such a skewed percentage that, in fact, I think native speakers of English around the world is only about 5%. So why is it that 50% of websites are in English? So I think that we have those of us who can speak multiple languages, who have our own mother tongues, should try to create more content in our local language and to support internationalization, because the internet is supposed to connect the world's population, to let us understand cultures that are different from ours. So I think that there's an advantage in if languages are dying out in real life, then they're dying out at even a faster rate if, as we move online, we don't bring our own languages onto the web. If everybody's more and more people are moving on the web, and then they're switching to English, what's going to happen to our own language and our own culture, like 5, 10, 20 years down the road? Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
you.
Thank you a lot.